Imagine two children are born on the same day. One is born in Switzerland, the other is born in Nigeria. Neither child has done anything. Neither has made a decision. Neither has worked a single day. Yet, from the moment they take their first breath, their economic futures are already dramatically different. One will grow up surrounded by stable institutions, strong infrastructure, reliable electricity, high quality education, and one of the strongest currencies on earth. The other may grow up in an economy struggling with inflation, unstable infrastructure, capital shortages, and a currency that loses value year after year. Why? Most people think they know the answer. Some blame corruption, others blame culture, others blame geography. And while all of these factors matter, they don't fully explain the pattern. Because when you zoom out and look at the world as a whole, a strange question begins to emerge. Why do some countries seem to move effortlessly toward wealth while others spend generations trying to catch up? Why does the gap between rich and poor nations often survive decades of reforms, aid programs, foreign investment, and economic development plans? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, what if the global economy is not simply a race? What if it is a game where some players started with advantages so large that everyone else is still trying to recover from them? This is not a story about villains. It is not a conspiracy theory. It is not a claim that success is impossible. It is a story about systems, because systems shape outcomes long before individuals make choices. And some systems become so large that they are almost invisible. The modern global economy is one of those systems. Every day, billions of people participate in it without ever seeing its architecture. They work, they save, they invest, they pay taxes, they buy products, they chase opportunities. Yet very few stop to ask a simple question: who designed the rules? To answer that question, we need to travel back in time, not decades, generations, back to a world that no longer exists, a world shattered by war. In 1945, much of Europe lay in ruins. Factories were destroyed, cities were damaged, trade networks had collapsed, tens of millions of people were dead. The old international order had broken apart. World leaders understood something important. If they failed to rebuild the global economy, instability would return, and instability often leads to conflict. So a new economic architecture was created, a system designed to increase trade, encourage growth, and prevent another global catastrophe. In many ways, it succeeded. International trade expanded dramatically, global living standards improved, extreme poverty declined across much of the world. But every system creates winners and losers, and over time, certain countries gained advantages that became increasingly difficult for others to challenge. Think of the global economy as a giant city. Some countries own the skyscrapers, some own the banks, some control the ports, some write the software, some create the technologies everyone else depends on. Meanwhile, other countries provide raw materials, cheap labor, or assembly services. Everyone participates, but not everyone occupies the same position, and position matters. A country that exports advanced technology earns very different profits than a country exporting raw materials. A country that designs products captures more value than a country assembling them. A country whose currency is trusted worldwide possesses powers unavailable to countries whose currencies are constantly under pressure. This creates an economic hierarchy, not necessarily because anyone planned it, but because successful systems tend to reinforce themselves. The more wealth a country accumulates, the more resources it has to invest in education, infrastructure, research, technology, and institutions. Those investments generate even more wealth, which funds even more investment. Success compounds, just like interest. Now imagine the opposite. Imagine trying to build world-class infrastructure while struggling with debt. Imagine funding scientific research while fighting inflation. Imagine attracting investors while political instability scares capital away. Every challenge makes the next challenge harder. Failure compounds too. This is one of the most misunderstood truths in economics. Wealth creates options, poverty removes them, and over time, those differences become enormous. But if this is true, another question appears. How did today's wealthy nations become wealthy in the first place? Because when we look closely at history, we discover something surprising. Many of the countries that now advocate free markets and open competition did not develop under those conditions. When they were still climbing, they often protected their industries. They invested heavily through government programs. They restricted foreign competition. They nurtured domestic businesses until they became globally competitive. In other words, they used tools that many developing nations are now discouraged from using. That doesn't mean those policies always work. History is more complicated than that, but it does mean the path to development was rarely as simple as modern economic textbooks sometimes suggest. The reality is that economic development has never been a straight line. It is a struggle for technology, a struggle for capital, a struggle for talent, and perhaps, most importantly, a struggle for time. Because countries are not competing against the past, they are competing against nations that have already spent decades or even centuries building advantages. Imagine entering a marathon after everyone else has been running for 3 hours. Even if you run faster, catching up becomes incredibly difficult. That is the challenge many developing nations face. Not because their people lack intelligence, not because they lack ambition, but because they are entering a race that started long before they arrived. And yet, despite all of these obstacles, some countries have managed to break through. South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, China. Their rise proves something important. The wall is not impossible to climb, but understanding how they climbed it requires understanding the forces that keep others trapped. And one of those forces begins with something almost every country needs: money. Not local money, global money, the currency that sits at the center of the international financial system, the currency that influences trade, debt, investment, and power itself, the US dollar. And once we understand how that system works, the hidden structure of the modern economy begins to reveal itself. The currency that rules the world. Imagine you own a small business. You work hard, you sell products, you earn money. But there is one strange rule. No matter how successful your business becomes, you are not allowed to print the money your suppliers demand. Every time you need inventory, you must first obtain someone else's currency. Now imagine running an entire country under those conditions. Because for much of the world, that is exactly how the modern financial system works. Most people think power comes from armies. Some think it comes from technology. Others believe it comes from natural resources. But one of the greatest forms of power in human history is much simpler: the ability to issue the currency everyone else needs. Today, that currency is the US dollar. If oil is traded internationally, dollars are usually involved. If governments borrow from international investors, dollars are often involved. Imagine two countries. Country A issues the currency the world wants. Country B does not. When country A needs money, it can create more of its own currency and sell debt denominated in that currency. When country B needs money, investors may demand foreign currency debt, higher interest rates, or both. One country finances itself using money it controls. The other often depends on money it does not control. That difference changes everything, because economic growth requires investment. Factories require investment. Roads require investment. Power plants require investment. Ports require investment. Technology requires investment. And investment requires capital. For wealthy countries, access to capital is often taken for granted. For developing countries, it can become one of the biggest obstacles to growth. Imagine a government trying to modernize its economy. It needs railways, industrial equipment, energy infrastructure, digital networks. The projects are expensive, domestic savings aren't enough, so the government borrows. At first, everything looks promising. New projects begin, construction expands, jobs appear, growth accelerates.